Thank you very much, Renia. Thank you for this privilege, allowing me to introduce today's speaker. It's also a privilege to be working with today's speaker, and that's Christoph Hafner. Hi, Christoph, and thank you very much for giving the talk for us this evening. I'll just introduce you briefly. Christoph is a professor in the City University of Hong Kong in the Department of English, one of the department's longest standing members. So that's a pleasure to have you here. And also I can see we have Vijay Bhatia as well, who has been in the department with Christoph also for a long time. So we have a lot of tradition here. And one of the traditions that Christoph has been developing is multimodality. And that's what attracted us to Christoph's work, because as part of his approach in multimodality, he does analyze gestures. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So the wide area that Christoph works in is it could be called language for specific purposes and professional communication. And he specializes in different domains, especially teaching and learning and legal communication. And as I mentioned, he works with notions of multimodality and also digital literacies. And it's within that context that he comes towards, he comes to the topic of gesture, and has been analyzing gesture in some of his legal communication work that he's going to introduce us to today. So Christoph is author and co-author of many publications, including 2 books, Understanding Digital Literacies with Rodney Jones, and English in the Discipline, in the Disciplines with Lindsay Miller. Christoph is also current president of the Asia Pacific Association for Language and for Language for Specific Purposes and Professional Communication. So once again, thank you very much, Christoph. We're really looking forward to your insights and your analyses, the work you've been doing with gesture. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon, for that generous introduction, and thank you everybody for making it along today. Thanks to the association as well, the ISGSHK, for giving me this opportunity to share my work. I want to begin with a bit of a disclaimer, just to say that although I am interested in multimodality, the extent to which I can claim to be a gesture expert is very negligible. So I'm looking forward to having your input on the work that I'm presenting here today. I'm going to be focusing on multimodal conduct and professional discourse identity in oral advocacy. And in particular, that is a context that involves the activity at law school called mooting, which is a little bit similar to a mock trial. And you may or may not be familiar with that pedagogical practice. But having observed teams at the university preparing for mooting competitions, I have quite a nice data set that does involve multimodal conduct and presenting legal arguments in the context of mooting arbitrations. I want to thank as well my collaborator Tonggal Sun at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, as she's done most of the analysis that you're going to see today. I'm very grateful to her for that input. To begin with then, what I want to do is take a look at this area of language and law and English for academic legal purposes and explain a little bit how I see that. So this is to situate very generally the work that I'm doing. Look a little bit into multimodal conduct in language and law. Take a look at a concept of discourse identity that I'll try to operationalize actually in relation to gesture as well. Then I want to introduce you to the case study, which is a series of team meetings of students preparing for mooting competitions, looking at the insiders' perspectives on gesture, and so mainly focusing on the perspectives that they express about how you should gesture in a moot. And then we'll take a look at conclusions, implications, and the way forward from there. So turning first of all to the work that's been done on legal discourse from a variety of perspectives. First of all, looking at the range of disciplines that are interested in some way in issues of language and discourse as they relate to law. Of course, there's a lot of work that's gone on here, and it's very variable in terms of the approach. Today, I want to highlight a number of interrelated strands of research. The first of these you could call critical discourse studies in the legal context that tend to draw on the approach of linguistic anthropology to examine issues of power in the legal system and at law school. And this work is especially interesting for the detailed account of the socio-cultural context that it provides. Secondly, the next one down there is the work on professional communication, which is concerned with understanding the form and function of that professional communication. And I would identify two main traditions here, legal linguistics and forensic linguistics on the one hand, as well as English for specific purposes on the other. And it's convenient to break this down into written legal genres and then also spoken interaction. We can see how different types of written genres become relevant, those that construct the law, for example, like legislation, and those that are used to interpret the law, like opinions and judgments. And this work establishes rhetorical structures of argument that are commonly used, and therefore they are expected in law. And as such, it's relevant to any study of arguments presented in oral advocacy as well. And the second strand of research here is the one that focuses on spoken interactions, like courtroom interaction or lawyer-client interaction or police interviews. And this work can also inform study of oral advocacy at law school, but it hasn't engaged with that particular context yet. It has stuck to much more high-stakes interactions, although the context of mooting, as we'll see, is quite high stakes for the students involved. Thirdly, there's the area of English for academic legal purposes, which has examined a number of written genres that law students encounter. So now we're getting into the pedagogical student domain. It, of course, includes some of the professional genres that have been studied elsewhere, like legislation and judgments, but it also includes pedagogical genres like legal textbooks and so on. And that work is again useful from the point of view of establishing what kind of argument structures are expected in those contexts, but also again falls short when it comes to oral pedagogical genres which haven't been systematically considered in the legal discipline. That might be surprising, as a matter of fact, given how important a skill excellent oral presentation is considered to be in the legal context, but that's how the things stand at the moment. And finally, of tangential interest is the work on language socialization in legal settings as well. Here you see insiders' perspectives that I'm going to present, providing opportunities for language socialization. But today I'm actually more interested in the substance of those perspectives, what people say about gesture, and how they relate to multimodal conduct. One of the things that comes through in all of this research is the idea that becoming a lawyer involves adopting a certain way of thinking. And when you go to law school, it may well be the first thing that you hear them say, that over the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to learn to think like a lawyer. Perhaps that doesn't mean exactly what you think it does. Some interesting insights into what thinking like a lawyer is comes from the works of Conley and O'Barr in the American context, who examined small claim tribunals in the US and observed the way that people there made their arguments to the judge. This is a really interesting context because in those contexts, you aren't allowed to be represented by a lawyer. And so what you have there is lay people presenting their arguments, and they do that in various different ways. Conley and O'Barr, that is, identify two different kinds of litigant. The first kind are called relational litigants, and as you can see from the quote here, they believe that the law is empowered to assign rewards and punishments according to broad notions of social need and entitlement and concepts like justice and so on. And on the other hand, you have rule-oriented litigants. Bear in mind, these are all still lay litigants taking their cases to court. And they believe that the law is a system of precise rules for assessing responsibility and will reject as irrelevant anything that's not circumscribed within those rules. And out of those two orientations, it's the rule-oriented litigants that do better. and they're able to make their case in a way that the judge can understand. That particular kind of legal reasoning or thinking like a lawyer also comes through in discourse structures that have been observed. So if we look at law school, we have a common pedagogical genre called the legal problem question answer, and it involves addressing legal issues in a kind of simulated case. And this will involve raising issues, stating the law, providing the authority for that law, and then applying that law to facts before reaching a kind of conclusion. Similarly, in barristers' opinions, in the professional context, you have something very similar going on there. As you can see, these discourse structures resemble one another. So considering those two genres, I'd suggest that we can identify some similarities between them and also some differences. So for example, although the academic assignment is likely to be responding to a different set of circumstances, for example, an academic audience rather than a professional or business audience, and sometimes they will have different goals. For example, in the pedagogical context, you really want to show off knowledge rather than simply generate an answer to the problem. Nevertheless, these two genres both index the legal culture by both adopting the same form of rule-oriented legal reasoning. So, I'd like to suggest that expert members of a particular professional community demonstrate their expertise in the discourse of their professional writing by exploiting generic resources that align themselves with, first of all, the aims of the particular professional community, and secondly, the tacitly held beliefs and values of the relevant disciplinary culture. And what I'm going to be suggesting today is that those assumptions and tacitly held beliefs extend to things like how we should gesture in argument. So the question that I'm looking at is how are multimodal resources implicated when it comes to demonstrating expertise in this way in oral argument? Work on multimodal conduct in language and the law has been quite interesting and influential to the presentation I'm giving you today. It includes things like looking at police interviews and courtroom interaction. And in the context of courtroom interaction rather, I've been influenced by the work of Martosian and Gilbert, who in this book, Multimodal Conduct in the Law, define multimodal conduct as the integration of speech, gesture, gaze, material artifacts, posture, and movement in courtroom performance. It's quite interesting to see the way that they draw material artifacts into that definition as well. Why bother with multimodal conduct? So first of all, and this is coming from Martosian and Gilbert, they suggest that a focus on language alone provides an incomplete picture with important details going missing. They point out that the court record that is generated in a trial consists entirely of words recorded with no information about how they were used. And this is actually a major flaw in the system because there's great potential for misunderstandings on appeal when you review the transcript to try and figure out what happened in the lower court. They also point out that multimodal conduct allows for the construction of identity, and they give the example of the thinking face, which I think comes from Goodwin. I'm not entirely sure, actually. The thinking face, they relate to an expert witness on the stand. In this case, it's a doctor. And they point out that part of the construction of expertise that this doctor presents is stopping, pausing, thinking, which usually involves look up, and then providing an answer after that. They also talk about the way that multimodal conduct allows for the expression of stance and talk about a cheek screw gesture employed by a prosecutor in one case. It's something like that. I'm not sure if that comes across or not, but the meaning that they attribute to it is, oh, come on, give me a break. Now, in a court of law, if you're examining a witness, you're not allowed to say to them, oh, come on, give me a break. But using gesture, you're able to make that kind of meaning. So in conclusion, then, multimodal conduct of this kind can disrupt the normal rules of turn-taking in the courtroom. An additional example there would be if I present a visible stance of disgust or disbelief. as somebody is providing testimony that could influence the way that the jury receive that testimony. And such gestures can also disrupt other procedural rules on what kinds of contributions are allowable in court as well. So gesture plays a really interesting role in courtroom interactions. I want to also take a look at this concept of discourse identity. That's the identity that you project in discourse, the persona that you inject into your written text or your oral interactions. And some people, like Goffman, G, and Scollin, consider discourse identity in terms of how we present ourselves in interactions in everyday life. And others, like Ivanich and Hyland, interested in academic writing, consider the selves that we present in order to display membership of a particular group. When I talk about discourse identity, I would maintain that a discourse identity is a representation in text or interaction. It therefore includes gesture that presents a self, a persona, a recognizable kind of person, which aligns the speaker or writer with the values of the relevant discourse community, making use of conventional forms of expression. So these are the ones that are expected, which can be genres and interactions related to that discourse community, and thereby identify the speaker or writer as an expert community member. So to extend that idea just a little bit, Scollin makes some interesting points about discourse identities, pointing out that they are not the same as social identities. In the mooting situation that I'm going to describe, this is very clear because while students participating are clearly socially and institutionally identified as law students, to succeed in their arguments in front of a professional judge, by the way, they need to adopt the discourse identity of lawyer, and they need to talk like a lawyer. Also, that discourse identity is in fact the normative identity in that situation, the identity they are expected to claim. And this raises the question, what language or discourse do I have to use in order to effectively claim that expected identity? Finally, Scollin also points out that there are always going to be matches and mismatches in terms of those identities. One kind of mismatch occurs when students depart from the normatively expected discourse identity, and this may relate to communication challenges. It can make it harder for them to get their message across if they don't enact that identity effectively. And it might make them less persuasive as well. So I'd like to turn to the study at this point, and a preliminary question, of course, is why investigate mooting? Well, one reason is it's a very high stakes genre in law at the law school. It's considered by pretty much everybody to be a very challenging kind of a interaction. Looking at what mooting actually is, give you a bit more information about that. We can see this as a kind of mock trial in the academy, although it is solely based around legal argument rather than introducing any evidence. Students are given a simulated fact situation or dispute. And in the one that I observed, this was over 50 pages worth of documents. They then work in teams and role play advocates to parties to the dispute, and they need to develop both written and legal written and spoken arguments. First, creating a kind of memo, which is submitted to the competition organizers, and then after that, they will attend the competition and present arguments against each other. Eventually, everybody gets knocked out until there's only one team left standing. When we think about the generic structure, at the macro level, it's divided into, after introductions, two main parts, which are procedural arguments and substantive arguments. The part on procedure addresses the question whether the tribunal has jurisdiction to hear the claim, as far as the substantive issues go, this is the substance of the argument. So in the case that I was observing, it was an alleged breach of contract for sale of goods. What you have in each case is one party going first, followed by the other party, and then a chance for a final 1-minute rebuttal and surrebuttal by both sides as well. If you look at the argument structure at a lower level, you see that arguments are presented in accordance with this rules-based reasoning that we've been talking about, where claims are supported by warrants, which can take the form of law, and this is in turn backed by legal text like legislation or cases. But claims can also be supported by facts of the problem or suggestions for policy. All of this, though, happens in a rule-based framework. Throughout such an argument, students will regularly be interrupted. That's the fun part of these moots. If you're lucky, you'll get through about 1 minute of prepared speech before a judge pulls you off on a tangent and starts questioning you about your submission in some other way. So that leads one of our informants to say that an arbitration, if it's a good one, will become an intelligent discussion. It's kind of more considered to be kind of a conversation. The study itself was an ethnographic study in which I observed a team of mooters and their coaches over a period of about 6 to 8 months, and they were preparing for the Willem C. Vies arbitration mooting competitions. One of these is actually held in Hong Kong every year, and the other one is held in Vienna. They use the same fact situation, and many teams go to both of these events. In terms of my observations, this can be divided up into 3 phases. A writing phase where students are collaboratively constructing memoranda, and then an advocacy training phase, and finally the competition itself. And I sat in on a lot of the team meetings. We recorded those meetings. We recorded the practice hearings, as well as you can see under point 2, 13 practice hearings. That's what we'll focus on today. Those practice hearings included performances by the students, as well as feedback from the coaches too. So that's the set of data that we've got there. It also includes a range of community text like how-to guides on mooting, which we consulted to better understand community positions on issues of multimodal conduct as well. Also something that is addressed in those texts too. In terms of the analysis, we began with a thematic coding of field notes in which the coach's comments on multimodal conduct were identified. This led us to the relevant portions of the recorded data. So we could look at the comments that coaches were making and say, there seems to be a problem here. Let's go take a look at that in the recordings. We also followed up with qualitative analysis of the simulated moots, where we were able to identify the multimodal conduct in question whenever a coach said, you're not supposed to do it like that. We could follow up in that way. So we were addressing the questions of how multimodal conduct figures in a MOOC presentation, what do participants say about it, and what does that look like? I should say that the bulk of the data is really focused on these insiders' perspectives, but I will have some images of gestures for you, I promise. So in terms of multimodal aspects of communication, I want to present a specific focus, first of all, on gesture, gaze, posture, and facial expression. And then I'd like to discuss more general categories of embodied communication, including what the participants refer to as acting, physical appearance and organization of materials, and then lastly, a non-verbal communication system observed between the council. Okay, and so here's where things get interesting, because one of the first things that students learn is that they need to keep gesture to a minimum. So from the outset of the advocacy training, the mooters were instructed by coaches to always, at all times, keep their hands on the table during an arbitration hearing. So as you can see from this extract from one of the coaches, keeping your hands on the table is a key expression of professionalism in moot court as well. So he makes this connection between sitting in this way and acting as a professional, or at all times acting as a professional. So here's what that looks like with mooters having both hands on the table. The idea that you should keep gestures to a minimum, this is also something that's picked up in guidebooks as well. Okay, so let's take a look then at a couple of critical moments where the coaches said, okay, you've got it wrong. What was it that students were doing that was that drew that kind of criticism? I want to present two such critical moments where student mooters were using excessive gestures. The first is what we're calling a shoulder level vertical chopping gesture, and the second one is a kind of vertical chop beating gesture actually on the table. Both of those gestures were considered to be inappropriate and unacceptable by the coaches, the guest arbitrators, and peers who were observing. So when they debriefed, they gave feedback on these gestures. Here's an example of the vertical chopping gestures that I was talking about. Here, Karen is using the shoulder level vertical chopping gesture. It kind of looks a bit like this, and she then changes the angle of it so it looks a bit like that as well. She employed, therefore, a series of up-down vertical chopping gestures, as you can see in images 2, 3, and 4, and then palm face slightly up after that. Those gestures didn't really emphasize any particular words in the discourse, didn't serve a discourse function as such, and were considered inappropriate by the guest arbitrators. For example, in the feedback session, Tim advised Karen to avoid using that many hand gestures. Okay, so that was one of them. The second one, also a kind of chopping gesture. Here you can see in this figure a kind of vertical chop beating gesture. It's very hard to make out because this person in the foreground is unfortunately in the way. But you can see over here the hand resting on the table, and here you can see the vertical chop gesture, and he's making contact with the table. In fact, when he does his rebuttal, he does this so forcefully that it produces an audible sound that we can hear in the tape. In the feedback session after the practice hearing, both peers and coaches advised him to stop, as they put it, chopping the table. And this chopping the table beat was perceived as aggressive, which is interesting because in law, you're not supposed to be emotional, and discouraged by the mooters who were observing. So another thing is, how do you use gaze? I mean, if you're not going to use gesture, if you're going to keep gestures to a minimum, there must be other things that are going on, right? And one of the things that also gets picked up on is the strategic use of the gaze. So Rashid at some point noted the importance of maintaining a degree of eye contact with arbitrators. And this was in a case where Serena was looking down at her materials and read the text of a document. Nevertheless, she was expected to keep monitoring what the panel were doing, and apparently they appeared to be unable to follow her. This comment from the coach suggests that maintaining eye contact with arbitrators performs a kind of monitoring function and facilitates effective communication, and perhaps to a degree is expected as well. We also have this example where one of the guest arbitrators indicated that it's not sufficient to maintain eye contact only with the arbitrator who raised questions. You can see at the bottom of this example here, it's not very good of you to neglect any one of us. The idea that part of your job is to involve everybody in your presentation as well. And the resource to do that is gaze. Okay, then we have also facial expression. So this one's also kind of interesting. Again, if you're not really allowed to use your hands that much, you need to really rely on something else. But the advice that is given here is also to try and keep it neutral. It's important to stay calm and composed in moot court. When the mooters didn't know how to answer a question, they appeared anxious and reluctant, and according to peer observation, it was very obvious when the mooters didn't know what to say. Here we have some comments on Benoit's facial expression while he is listening to arguments that are being put either by the arbitrator or the other side. Rashid talks about him making his face, all these faces which you are making. And in fact, what he's doing is expressing a kind of affective stance of irritation and disapproval, which may be quite genuine, as other counsel are putting arguments forward. And this particular use of facial expression attracted this comment, as you can see. And you see right down the bottom here, it comes right down to, again, no facial reaction, no body language, no body movement. Don't make your face, no emotions, okay? So there's a kind of equation that's being drawn here between using the body and expressing emotion as well. And so the next category that I want to take a look at is quite an interesting one as well, where mooting is presented as a kind of acting. So the coaches note that oral advocacy requires acting, and a good oral advocate is expected to be an actor who conveys an impression of being able to think on one's feet in front of a tribunal. What we've got here is Gerd giving some indication of how you would answer a question. And of course, as I've indicated, there's lots of questions, lots of answering questions, and so on. And the mooters are incredibly well prepared for it. They spend at least 3 months preparing their speeches, interrupting each other, thinking of questions that might be asked in the moot, and then generating a list of answers to those questions as well. And what sometimes happens is that the students are so well versed in all of this that they'll go into a moot and possibly even start answering a question before the arbitrator has finished asking it, which is, of course, the height of rudeness. And so they need to stop and perform at this point in time. They've probably thought of this question before. They probably know what the best answer for it is. But as Gerd points out, I think you should wait for 1, possibly 2 seconds. And during those 2 seconds, you give the impression that you're thinking deeply. You become an actor. You give the impression, as he says, you're absolutely stunned by the question that has been asked. You're about to be spectacularly defeated. And the arbitrator is always thinking, ha, I've got you now. And at that point, you become an actor and you jump back in and you give your brilliant answer. And this is the impressive way to deliver a good answer. Okay, so still on the idea of mooting as acting then, in addition to pausing, mooters were advised to present a self that's able to improvise. So this is quite a similar point, really. It's not considered good form. It's not really valued if you present your speech in a kind of memorized format. And we have an example here given by Evan, who was an alumnus, talking about an experience that he had in previous years, where one of his colleagues provided a case citation. These are quite complex combinations of letters and numbers, but she had forgotten to put that case in her binder. She just knew it off by heart. She disguised the fact that she knew it off by heart. As you can see here, she remembered the citation for the case because she'd cited it a few times, but it wasn't actually there. And as she as it says here, she was actually, when she was putting her finger down, she was running her finger across a blank sheet of paper. And so there's this deception almost that's going on, and mooters are being actors. In terms of physical appearance, this turns out to be important for professionalism as well, and that's hardly really surprising. The mooters were instructed at all times to behave in an exceedingly professional manner, and according to Coach Gert, part of that is to be conservatively dressed, be it at a real hearing or at a simulated hearing. And before the first practice hearing, which was prompted by coaches, the mooters spent considerable time discussing appropriate dress, such as color combinations, in order to project a particular professional manner in front of arbitrators. Then when it comes to the actual organization of materials, what we have here is a top-down view of the table, and the coaches asked the students to organize and place mooting materials on the table to express a mooter's professionalism as well. Each council needed to have their own individual folder. These are quite thick, by the way, and these are supposed to have the most useful materials for that person's arguments, and they should also have a shared folder that's placed between them as well. The coaches drew comparisons with other teams who have just a mess of documents in front of them, and they were very disapproving of this and said that it made things look unprofessional. Students also developed a kind of non-verbal communication system at the prompting of their coaches. According to the coaches, talking to each other while opposing counsel is presenting is considered disturbing and indicates a lack of professionalism. So again, getting to conduct here as an index of professionalism. As Gerd noted, passing notes is considered to be clumsy as an alternative and sometimes too revealing as well. So they suggested that students develop some kind of color coding system which would communicate certain pre-established categories of meaning, I suppose. It's like a secret communication system or a kind of practice that could be particular to this particular team. You can see an example of it in action here at this point in the moot. Um, what have I called him again? Nimal, who is on the right side of these images, is delivering his rebuttal, and Karen on the left has realized that he has very little time left. So she picks up a pink slip, places it somewhere where Nimal can see it, and he immediately, the minute he sees it, asks for an extension of time. So that's how that works. So that brings us to the so what question. What does it all mean? The first point that I'd like to make is that by examining perspectives on multimodal conduct and how these relate to a professional identity, what we've hopefully been able to do is unpack what it is that makes a good professional advocate from the point of view of the legal insiders, and how that identity can be claimed multimodally. Okay, so based on the insiders' perspectives, a professional advocate is one who is calm, composed and rational, engaged and engaging, sharing their gaze around, remember, able to improvise, and think on their feet, organized and prepared, as well as being courteous and respectful. And you can claim this identity by using minimal gesture and unemotional facial expressions, using gaze and gaze shifts to engage all arbitrators, acting by pausing and displaying a thinking face when responding to questions, dressing in an appropriately conservative and lawyerly way, organizing materials systematically, and using a nonverbal communication system. And all of this, according to the coaches, would index that professional identity. This kind of multimodal conduct may differ markedly from that which students learn to produce in academic presentations, where gesture, I would suggest, is quite likely to play a much more prominent role, in fact. And so from the point of view of people teaching English for academic purposes, it would be very useful to have this information so that you don't train them in entirely the wrong way. So one thing to be wary of, though, are the potential cross-cultural differences and contextual differences that one can run into. An example of that was given quite a while ago now by Anna Leonteva at the ISGS in one of these webinars, when she presented her work on, I believe it's prosecutors' discourse in the courtroom in the United States, where they are working with a jury trial. And so the point there is that you've got a different kind of a context and a different audience. What she was seeing was a lot of gesture, and gesture being used in very specific and strategic ways to promote the interaction in that case. When we've got people who are interacting with other specialists, the role for gesture may be considerably different. Also, when we have people in different cultural contexts, the role for gesture may be very different as well. So I expect that these findings could be quite different if the same study was carried out in the United States, for example. One question that's interesting to consider is whether multimodal conduct can be taught. And one of the issues that arises is whether this kind of expression is under conscious control or not. Attempting to bring it under conscious control might itself create certain problems. A second issue is that if you take a kind of cookie cutter approach to genre instruction, where you say that certain multimodal conduct matches certain certain situations, that could also detract from authentic expression if it's applied in a very rigid way. But what's interesting, I think, is that I believe that I've observed this kind of teaching of appropriate multimodal conduct. So the coaches in this study worked very hard to make expectations clear, and students were able to understand those expectations and move towards them. I'm very interested in this idea of being an actor as a kind of strategic self-presentation as well, because what it's essentially saying is that you can control not just the way that you word things and phrase things and structure arguments, but also the way that you make use of your face, that you engage through your gaze, and that you use your body. And so much of the multimodal conduct here observed is strategic, carefully planned and rehearsed, and the impression of spontaneity and thinking on your feet is one that's managed by acting, pausing, displaying a thinking face, then taking a turn. And all of this aligns with expectations of the professional community and the values of that community as well. So, for example, in the legal community, being able to spontaneously defend your arguments and think on your feet is highly valued. Doing the same thing by memory, I think you score negative points if you do that. It's perhaps ironic that in their effort to claim the normative expert professional identity, mooters are being encouraged to be deceptive. They're covering up their use of frowned upon behaviors such as rote learning and memorization. And one question that will be interesting to look at in future, although it may be quite difficult to do so, is if so much of the MOOC performance is strategic and planned, and they really do plan this to the nth degree, what does unplanned and improvised performance look like? How do students cope? It will be difficult, though, I think, to identify these moments in the data because they are, after all, being deceptive. And so how I could identify when something is unplanned might actually be a bit of a challenge, come to think of it. I also want to draw attention to the use of the discourse identity as a useful analytic lens here. The methodology allowed us to zero in on those moments where the performed discourse identity diverged from the normative discourse identity based on the inside perspectives of the participants themselves, including the peers to the interaction, the coaches, and those guest arbitrators who came in and heard some of the arbitrations and the practice hearings. In future can also look at the role of multimodal conduct in a range of high-stakes moments. For example, answering questions by conceding, shaping co-constructed arguments, and that sort of thing. The question would be, what are the multimodal resources that are brought to bear in such moments? Another thing I think will be useful to look at here too is that we can take this idea and apply it to a whole range of different contexts. So how do you have to use your body in order to be a TV presenter, be a reporter, be a business person, and so on and so forth? I think that's something that could be quite a fertile sort of an area, perhaps. More generally as well, in ESP and EAP research, we are in need of more systematic study of spoken genres, the multimodal conduct that is involved, and the discourse identities that those genres afford, as well as connections to disciplinary cultures as well. And that's it. Thank you very much.